Good morning, everyone. In my previous talks with you, I had established the framework of approaching Walter Raleigh's discovery of Guyana, and in this class, that is today's class, we'll be going a bit more closer to the text, to the contents of the text, so that we can verify for ourselves how far the text fits into the framework that we have established with regard to Walter Raleigh's discovery of Guyana. Now, as you already know by now, the basic information about Walter Raleigh that would be necessary to process this text at a very basic level is the fact that, well, the question of who is Raleigh, well, by all accounts, as we already know by now, Raleigh is the archetype of the Elizabethan courtier. Like most Elizabethan courtiers, he began his life landless, and through his wit, intelligence, and capability, he could manage to secure the favor of Queen Elizabeth and get many titles. In fact, one of the titles was the patent on exploration of colonies formerly held by one of his half brother, Sir Humphrey Gilbert. And from the mid 1580s, his role essentially was that of an administrator of certain colonies held by his half brother. But at the same time, from the 1580s, he was working closely with his friends, some of whom include Thomas Harriot, Richard Hakluyt, and some others, to embark on colonial missions or projects. And it was not until 1597, when he was 40 years old, that he began leading a colonial expedition himself. So the year is 1595. Now the next question that comes down to us, and the question is already handled in an earlier class: why did he decide to do this in 1595 at the age of 40? He did it out of desperation. Why? Because he had fallen from Queen Elizabeth's favor and was even temporarily imprisoned, as we know, because he had secretly married one of her maids of honor. Both the expedition that is described in the discovery of Guyana and its later publication were a desperate attempt by Walter Raleigh to regain the favor of the Queen. Now, what is there in this text? For example, as a reader, when we read the discovery of Guyana, what is it that we encounter? To put it very briefly, and I am confident you'll be reading the whole text at some point in time, Walter Raleigh's account begins with himself, 150 men, 150, and 5 boats. Boats are obviously not boats in today's sense, they were ships, expedition ships, sailing to the island of Trinidad at the mouth of the Orinoco River, where they attack a Spanish fort. The Spanish governor of the region, who is named in the work as Antonio de Berrio, also was in search of El Dorado, or the land of gold, which is also known in Walter Raleigh's book as Manoa. And somehow or the other, Walter Raleigh came through his interaction with the Spaniards that Manoa is actually the central metropolis, or the golden metropolis as it were, of the empire of Guyana. The Spanish governor tried to control the region earlier with little success, and Walter Raleigh in his text quotes several Spanish sources in order to describe what the country of Guyana looks like. So it's a description of some received information. So it's not that he has actually gone into the place and is describing it. That is one. What they then do is they then travel up the Orinoco River with an Indian guide, that's a local guide, looking for Guyana and that golden metropolis. Most of the texts that we have before us are descriptions of his meetings with different Indians, that is, different locals, and of his forming alliances with them against the Spanish. Quite obviously, throughout the book, we do not find any evidence that Walter Raleigh finds gold or even comes closer to gold. And on his return to England, Walter Raleigh was criticized for failing in his mission, and he writes the discovery of Guyana to vindicate himself. That is to defend himself against the criticism that his mission has been a failure. Now, the book is about this. So, what do you get in the book? We'll be getting the moment you read the text, we'll be seeing it begins with a rather prosaic and a journalistic description of the beginning of the voyage. Walter Raleigh himself taking 150 men with 5 ships sailing, and after the land in the place, they find that a Spanish governor is already there who is also in search of gold and which has not yet found. Then the rest of the book is nothing but his engagement, Walter Raleigh's engagement with the locals. And most of the engagement consists partly of descriptions and partly of that typical colonial mindset of provoking the locals against the earlier colonizer, that is the Spanish. But ultimately, he could not sustain his expedition for long and had to go back empty handed. Now, what is inventive about Walter Raleigh's discovery is something that intrigues us even today. That is, why is it new? And in any case, in the Elizabethan age or in Tudor England, it's not that Walter Raleigh was the only voyager or he was the only one who was writing a voyage, a description of a voyage. The reason why this text is important to us, is more important than many other voyage descriptions, is because it serves 3 purposes. First, it is an attempt by Walter Raleigh to establish himself and regain the favor of the Queen. Now remember, Walter Raleigh was by no means an ordinary courtier. He was very close to the Queen. In fact, so close that when the Queen discovered that he had married secretly, she imprisoned him to the tower. That close. First. So it's not the description of a voyage undertaken by any ABC. No. The second thing is that Walter Raleigh's discovery is a very clear and unequivocal argument for colonization. This is the second one. That is, the entire book is based on the philosophical premise of the fact that England had to be a colony. This is the second. And the third important point is that the interpersonal relationship between the English sovereign or the monarch and the Spanish king was also an issue that is brought into sharp focus here because Walter Raleigh had a very clear cut order, and that was not to sack or not to attack or not to do anything against Spanish interests in Guyana. Why? Because that would impair the already hostile relationship between England and Spain in Europe. So it is for these three reasons, these three pivots as it were, that this book, among so many other voyage books, are important for us. Now, what is it? So, obviously, this book is a platform by which Walter Raleigh seeks to encourage Elizabeth to establish a colony in this, what he says or he describes as an unconquered territory, by allying with the local Indians against the Spanish. Because remember, in this book, there's a very famous line which Walter Raleigh says, a very famous sentence. He says, and I quote, "To conclude, Guyana is a country that hath yet her maidenhead." Most critics who have read or approached this particular work, including Stephen Greenblatt or Montrose or Fuller, they have to some extent, correctly I would say, interpreted discovery of Guyana as an invention. And we already know it, that most of the minute descriptions of Indians with heads in another part of their body, not in the place where head should be. So these are obviously absurdities, inventions, which have been deliberately put forward by Walter Raleigh in order to establish himself and regain a favor or importance in Elizabeth's court. This is one. The second thing is, there have been counter arguments as well to suggest that not everything in Walter Raleigh's discovery, yes, I'll be repeating all the three purposes again. Okay, I'll be repeating. There is another school of thought which tells that not everything in Walter Raleigh's discovery is made up, and there are certain descriptions of interactions of local Indians, their habits, their living standards, their food, their etiquette, their mode of interaction with one another, which clearly suggests that there had been some form of a first hand interaction between Walter Raleigh or Walter Raleigh's members in his expedition with the locals. So, not everything is made up. But the power of the book lies in the fact that he mixes both of them, the invention part and the reality part, with such narrative expertise that most people in his times believed that this was a genuinely described tale of an expedition. Now the next question is, there are two issues which are important at this point in time. The first issue is that Walter Raleigh wrote another book 20 years later. What was the name of the book? And I would expect you to correlate the contents of the book which he wrote 20 years later with this one, because that book also is built on the premise of colonial philosophy. What is the book? The book is The History of the World. The History of the World. There, uh, Walter Raleigh says, and I quote, "The end and scope of all history is to teach by example of times past such wisdom as may guide desires and actions." Unquote. Now notice the sentence itself. The extreme premise of superiority that is built on this concept of colonization. All he says, the end and scope of all history is to teach by example. So who would be teaching? Obviously the colonizers. Who would be taught? The colonized. By example of times past, such wisdom as may guide desires and actions. Now, quite obviously, here Walter Raleigh's discovery is framed as a guide, as a motivator for colonial conquests, as much as an advertisement. What sort of an advertisement is it? It is an advertisement that argues for investment in colonial enterprise, because we know that most colonial enterprises, which were expeditions, required a lot of money, and these expeditions were extremely uncertain by any means, and therefore one of Walter Raleigh's main motive was to argue for investment in the colonial enterprise. Remember the title of the text, The Discovery of Guyana. To be very specific and strict, it is not a discovery because that place had already been discovered by the Spaniards earlier. Okay, so technically it's not a discovery. I mean, Walter Raleigh is not discovering the place. Guyana had already been discovered by the Spaniards. And the second is the premise that that place has gold. Why of all metals gold? And clearly it was made up because there was an economic side to the title. In other words, the very fact that this is a book on the discovery of Guyana reveals that Walter Raleigh had at the back of his mind the importance of private investments to fund voyages, including even his voyage at any other later time, as I will tell you later, that actually happened. So, what is it? Nobody would invest unless there was a scope for return. And what would the return be? The return would obviously not be timber, because timber would be too low a return for a heavy investment in expeditions. It obviously had to be a very costly item in terms of density, and therefore gold. So clearly, and I believe that Walter Raleigh never thought that ordinary people would be reading this book from the first line to the last. Why ordinary? Even, educated courtiers would be reading the book from the first to the last to decide for themselves as to whether they're going to invest in one such expedition in future. Otherwise, the book does not contain any physical evidence or descriptions of evidence that he has got gold. But look at the misleading title. In other words, he wished to suggest that through the title itself, that there is much to be invested in this area, and therefore people who wish for high returns would rather invest in an expedition to Guyana. Okay, so technically the title itself is misleading, but whom does he mislead? He misleads people whom he is confident would not read the entire text. He would not read the entire text. They would not read it because there is nothing in the text which suggests that he has got gold. Therefore, the title itself suggests that this entire edifice of the work is actually a product of imagination. And it's obviously an argument for colonization. It is also an argument for investment in colonial ventures. The second thing is, in this book, while we read this book, we get an idea. It's a very interesting reading or an experience Walter Raleigh continuously differs his trip into the interiors of Guyana. In other words, the entire book is built upon an endless deferral. He will not go today, he'll be going tomorrow. He'll go into the interiors of Guyana another day. He'll be visiting Manoa, the metropolis or the capital of that place, which is obviously El Dorado, another day. And that another day never comes in this book. Therefore, many critics have suggested, and correctly so, that Walter Raleigh wished to build up a suspense of a visit, actual visit, which never takes place. He himself writes, Walter Raleigh, in the book, and I quote, I deferred the search for the country on the Guiana side of the river till my return down the river. Unquote. So technically, he himself is suggesting that he will be going to Guyana the moment he comes back from the place where he began his journey. He did come back, but he came back in order to return to England, not to visit the other side, the Guyana side of the river. So technically, we believe that he had never any serious intention of actually crossing the Orinoco River and going into the Guyana side in order to discover. Right? But at the same time, interestingly, he gives descriptions of very minute incidents, including, as I've said, some Indians, the oddly shaped physicalities of Indians, locals there, which he heard from hearsay. It's not that he has visited the place and seen them. No. But at the same time, Walter Raleigh is confident that whatever he writes will have the stamp of authority because he has obviously crossed the Atlantic, which very few explorers would do, and has gone into a place which is so very different from Europe or England. Right. So this is another aspect of this particular critical aspect of this particular text. The third aspect is again a very serious and a very important pointer to the fact that most of the English colonial philosophy was built on inciting some form of a conflict at some level between the other parties so that the English could entrench themselves well with little resistance. And we find it in almost every page of Walter Raleigh's book. What does he do? Every interaction of Walter Raleigh with the Indians is an attempt to provoke them against the Spaniards because he says the Spaniards are cruel and the locals would be well off if they accept the English as the colonizers. So his attempt is a very clever ploy to set up Indians against the locals, against the Spaniards, so that in some sense the Spaniards' hold over the Indians decrease, which might create a vacuum, and England may visit the place, and England may conquer the place. So technically, when we read this book is important for these many reasons. In other words, the fact that the Spaniards are very different from the English, the fact that the Spaniards are very poor colonizers, the fact that the Spaniards are people who would go into conquests by killing people. We have descriptions of the cruelty of the Spaniards. We don't know for sure. We have no means of confirming whether that cruelty was actually carried out because Spain was a colony and Spain remained a colony for several years after Walter Raleigh, and England could not. So technically, Walter Raleigh's The Discovery of Guyana is or it can be interpreted as some form of a vehicle for Walter Raleigh's prescription of conquest of a colonial enterprise in Guyana. So it's clearly a colonial text, but at the same time, it would be interesting for us to understand that when this book was published, remember Walter Raleigh wrote this book and he forwarded it to one of the courtiers of the Queen, Robert Cecil. But unfortunately, this book did not gain the prominence that Walter Raleigh expected in the court, after which he published it for public reading. Okay, so initially this description was a description that was meant for the royalty. As I told you, he wrote it typically to gain a favor or regain the position that he once lost before the queen. But once that failed, he published this book for public reading. This is one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is Walter Raleigh's The Discovery of Guyana is a prescription for colonization. Now, obviously, this can be interpreted as some form of a strategy of Walter Raleigh. Now, remember, Walter Raleigh might have enemies in the court of Queen Elizabeth II, but neither Walter Raleigh nor his enemies could be possibly averse to the prospects of gaining gold at the end of an expedition. So it was a very clever ploy in the sense of Walter Raleigh, or ploy of Walter Raleigh to suggest or to imply that you may be my enemy, I may fail to gain the favor of the queen, but nevertheless, there is a land which is waiting to be conquered, and the land contains gold. So it's some form of a very clever enticement put forward by Walter Raleigh to decrease or dissolve the enmity that these people or ill will that these people had against Walter Raleigh himself. So he was writing this book clearly from a position not of strength but of weakness. And his entire book is nothing but a very, very sustained ploy in order to endear himself before the people who were close to the queen or to the queen herself. So technically, when we read this book, we read it partly as description, a part of which is invented, partly as hearsay, which he heard from so and so source, and we read this book partly as a platform where Walter Raleigh was desperately trying to regain the favor of the powers at the court by giving them a chance to explore an area that he felt was unexplored, and that fact that the area contained gold was sufficient indication he felt that these people would forget their ill will for him or towards him and go on another discovery. So it's an appeal for investment in one sense. It is a pathfinding text in another sense. And at a personal level, it is also a text that wishes or aims at regaining the favor of the queen. So when we approach this text from, let's say, an examination point of view, clearly we are doing it for that. Only a small part of the content will be focused on what actually happens in the text. As I've said and I repeat, there is very little of a story in the text in the sense we expect stories in novels. It's a description of a voyage which Walter Raleigh himself undertook with 150 men and a few ships. He goes up to Orinoco, encounters the Spaniards there. There's a skirmish in which he loses his own son. But after that, Walter Raleigh continuously goes on a description spree without actually encountering the Spaniards, and he himself says he continuously deferred his visit to the other side of the river, the Guiana side of the river, because he thought he would be doing it while he was returning downstream. Right? So technically, there's a very little story element in this particular book. Most of our approach to this particular text will be based on these three accounts, and I repeat it again. What are the three purposes? The first purpose, as I've said, is it's a work that tends to be descriptive or prescriptive of colonization. First, second, it is a work that at a personal level aimed at mending a fence with the queen. As I told you, and I repeat, Walter Raleigh is not an ordinary courtier or an ordinary Elizabethan. He was very close to the queen, and therefore his struggle to regain the lost favor was a very serious struggle, and he wished to write this book partly to regain that lost favor. And the third purpose of this book is an international relations aspect. In other words, since Guyana was already under the control of Spain and Walter Raleigh had a very clear cut mandate that he was free to go to Guyana, but under no circumstance would he antagonize the Spaniards there, because the English monarch, whether it was Elizabeth the First or whether it was Elizabeth's successor, James, they never wanted to antagonize Spain. Right. So essentially, the third purpose was to focus on England's, or we would focus on England's relationship with Spain and how that is played out in the context of Raleigh's encounters with the Spaniards in Guyana. So these are the three platforms on which this particular work is built. Sorry. Now the text of this edition is freely available in the net. You can go through any text that is available. But the basic premise while you are reading this book should be these three. You will find that while you are reading, that the part that you are reading will fall automatically almost into one of these three parameters. That is a personal parameter of trying to regain the lost favor, or a descriptive parameter of a description of a journey, which it might be an invention, but nevertheless there's a descriptive element. And the third element is that international relations aspect of England vis-a-vis Spain, with the focus on Guyana, which was already a Spanish colony. And the other issue, and I'll be dealing with this issue in the next class in some greater detail, why did Walter Raleigh choose this title, which is so very misleading? That you may have known by now, or that the discovery of Guyana is not the full title. The full title read Discovery of the Large, Rich and Beautiful Empire of Guyana, with the relation of the great and golden city of Manoa. So this was the full title. Now, so much of the title is misleading. It's not a discovery, as I've said. It's not a large, rich and beautiful empire of Guyana, because he never himself went there. And the third is that golden city of Manoa. The city was never golden. So the entire title is based on, as I've said, on an element, on a motive to deliberately mislead people who may not have enough time or resources in Walter Raleigh's time to go through the text. Otherwise, he might have been challenged by any reader who has read the last sentence till the last sentence, that you are telling it's a beautiful golden city, but where is the gold there? And you, if you claim that you have visited the place, what is the evidence that you have brought in gold? So clearly Walter Raleigh's position is very, very weak, and he tried something. And if he tried it because he had to regain a favor, clearly we know historically that he failed, right? So when we read this in terms of a text for an examination, clearly the items would be, or the themes would be, first, a critical commentary on the title, or how does the title appeal to you, in a sense, or how significant is the title, first. Second is examination of this particular text as a text that promotes colonization, and that is the reason why this text is in this particular paper. And the third element is, how far is this text a personal text? That is, you'll be asked to correlate with Walter Raleigh's biography, in a sense, his ascent and descent, and attempt to rise again in the Elizabethan court, and how he wished to use this text in order to achieve his ends at a personal level. Okay, so these are the three broad parameters of critical examination that would be required of any reader who is reading the discovery of Guyana as a critical text today, right? So we stop here today. In my next class with you, I'll be focusing on something supplementary. Supplementary means I would expect that you would correlate this particular text with other competing texts which were descriptions of voyages or expeditions which other sailors took. Because when you are reading a book which is in a sense a description, or a claimed description of an actual expedition, you have to keep in mind that there were other texts by colonizers or by people who are exploring other parts of the world in Walter Raleigh's time, or a bit before and after, and how far Walter Raleigh's text compares and contrasts with other travel accounts of the time. I would expect that you will be putting in those references as well of other travel accounts. They were also colonizing attempts, okay, when you are writing your answers, right? So I stop here today. If you have any clarificatory questions, you may ask. And by the way, after my next lecture would be my final lecture on Walter Raleigh's discovery of Guyana. After that, I'll be sharing with you over email certain critical materials which will help you to frame your answers and their contexts. Right? Okay. If you have any questions,